Castles. Citadels of world heritage. All over Europe, millions flock to see these masterpieces in stone. They are drawn by the astonishing scale of construction and by a sense of a lost world of heroism and chivalry. But castles are more than magnificent monuments to a past that's dead and gone. They hold the key to understanding a crucial period in the growth of our civilization. In this series, we're on a journey to discover how castles were built and why they were constructed the way they were, how that changed over centuries, and why they still have a grip on our imagination today. We'll meet the castle builders, the labourers and masons who did the hard work, the geniuses of design who imagined these medieval megastructures, the structural engineers who turned them into a reality, and the kings and barons who commissioned them and lived in them. We'll show how the big history of the Middle Ages, the wars of France and England, shaped the castle. And how, in 1,000 bloody sieges and battles, the castle changed the course of that history. If you want to understand how the modern world was constructed, you need to understand the castle builders. The NATO Summit, Wales, 2014. The largest gathering of international leaders ever to take place in Britain. The commanders-in-chief of 60 of the world's most powerful armed forces have come together to debate and strategize. What they decide here may shape the future for all of us. And, in a masterstroke of modern media management, they've come to pose for their official pre-dinner portrait in front of a castle, Cardiff Castle. Castles have always been symbols of military might and authority, but they're also strongly associated with noble ideals and gracious living. Even in this era of high-tech warfare, it's an image worth 1,000 headlines. In this series, we've seen how building a medieval castle was a major feat of logistics and hard work, ingenuity and craftsmanship. And how the work of the castle builders stood up to the military onslaughts that were unleashed against it. In this final episode, we'll see why the castle matters, and how its appeal has always rested on its dual purpose, as a fortress and a residence.
A castle's primarily to defend a lord or a noble or a king, his family and his household, and also to command the territory of which he's the owner.
It's a very difficult balancing act, creating a building that is at the same time homely and warlike. And I think that is what makes castles fascinating. Reconciling those apparently contradictory imperatives is what makes them such a delight for children and grown-up medieval historians.
But as time went by, the balance between those functions shifted. The military effectiveness of castles began to decline as they became more and more vulnerable to the power of artillery. This is the story of that major change in the primary purpose of a castle. From fort to palace. It's a tale that will take us to France and to Germany, and into a new industrial age where the castle surprisingly gets a new lease of life. Across the centuries, castle builders became decorators and dreamers, cementing the place of their creations in the imaginations of everyone. The castle becomes a place of luxury, fantasy, and ceremony. Windsor Castle on the outskirts of London. In terms of the ceremony that's conducted here, this may be the most celebrated castle of them all. Windsor remains one of the principal homes of the British royal family. It's a tourist destination of global significance. Its status as a symbol glorifying the English monarchy dates back hundreds of years, to the reign of Edward III in the 14th century. Windsor was already a substantial castle when Edward came to the throne, but he spent a king's ransom enhancing its grandeur and majesty. It was said to be the most expensive secular building project of the entire Middle Ages in England. But it wasn't simply a vanity project. Edward had decided to press his claim to the throne of France. It was a bold and risky move. Success depended on the military support of the English nobles. Edward decided to make Windsor a focus for the cult of chivalry which underpinned his call to arms. Edward's stroke of genius was to reach back into the founding myths and legends of Britain, to the stories of King Arthur and his knights. Here at Windsor, he would construct a Camelot for his own age.
This is a really interesting moment politically and historically because the 100 Years' War has just started. It's in its early years. And he wants to make a bold statement, not just to France, who he's at war with, but to the rest of Europe. For Edward, aligning himself with King Arthur of great legend was going to make a bold statement. So Edward makes a promise, makes an oath that he's going to establish a vast round table of 300 knights, according to the chroniclers, another round table in Edward's own time. One of the special things about Arthur and his knights in legend is that they are peacekeepers. They protect the weak and they fight legitimate causes. So all of this ideological background that comes from the Arthurian myth feeds into Edward III's political agenda.
As the war against France begins in earnest, Edward honours his son, the Black Prince, for his valour in the field. And he organises spectacular tournaments and builds a new home for a select band of knights back in Windsor. The Order of the Garter, with its famous motto, "Shame on him who thinks evil of this," is the oldest and most prestigious order of chivalry in Britain. In using the castle to buttress his royal authority, Edward III could take inspiration from his own genealogy. He was the son of Edward II, whose birth at Caernarvon Castle had been a piece of flamboyant political theatre, orchestrated by his father, Edward I, Edward Longshanks. Longshanks may have used brutal force to subdue the Welsh and the Scots, but he was not afraid to use more romantic notions to reinforce his claims on Britain, as a remarkable object that's now housed in another royal castle shows us. This is the Great Hall of Winchester Castle. The enormous painted table that now hangs on the wall was said to be the very round table used by King Arthur and his knights. The names of the 24 knights appear in their allocated places around the edge of the table. In fact, Scientific tests date the construction of the table to the reign of Edward Longshanks. It was probably built to celebrate the betrothal of one of the king's daughters. And English monarchs continued to value this powerful symbol. In the 16th century, Henry VIII had the table repainted with a Tudor rose at its centre. The connection with Arthur legitimised a claim to the throne, and a central feature of the Arthurian myths was the castle. Unlike Winchester or Windsor, Tregearig Castle in South Wales is off the beaten track. Few visitors come here. Indeed, few people know that it even exists. And yet this secretive location has plenty to reveal about how the castle was actually used to delight and to entertain nobility in the Middle Ages. And it has something to say too about the castle's place in one of the most famous tales of King Arthur's knights. But the first thing that strikes you about the ruined castle is the sheer scale of the place.
Tregearig is the biggest inner wall, the biggest single enclosure of a castle anywhere in England and Wales. Bigger than Caerphilly, bigger than Windsor. What you see today is an enormous gatehouse and a very imposing tower connected by a curtain wall. So superficially, it looks a very impressive, defendable structure. Go inside these buildings and there's something very different. They're divided up into rooms, each of which is provided with ensuite facilities, a toilet or a latrine, a wash basin, there are fireplaces, there are glazed windows, and they're clearly not anything to do with defence. They're all to do with accommodating important people who came to this castle to retreat away from the cares of being a lord or lady.
The luxurious toilet facilities were finished with a quality of craftsmanship worthy of a palace. Even the masonry below the toilets shows an attention to detail which seems almost excessive to their purpose. But it would have been all too convenient for any would-be attacker to break into the castle via the shafts of these latrines. They indicate that the effort and resources lavished on building this huge castle weren't deployed to any military purpose. And this wasn't even the main castle used by the Lords of Usk. Tregearig was simply a base for them to entertain their guests and to go hunting. For the super-rich of the Middle Ages, the thrill of the chase was a serious business. Something that's very well evidenced in the art and the romantic literature of the times.
Castles and hunting are the subject of many medieval romances. These are the things that influenced the great men of the day. They're the things that they aspired to be, one of the heroes of the great medieval romance. One of the best known is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And Sir Gawain sets out on a journey to find the Green Knight to honour his bargain. He enters a hunting park. He crosses an open area of ground known as a lawn in which deer would graze or be driven for the hunt. And he sees on a hill above him the most wonderful castle rising up through the trees. And when you read that passage and you approach Tregearig across its open area of ground, it is almost as if you're Sir Gawain and living the poem for real.
In the mythical castle, Gawain finds himself isolated. But it's his integrity, not his skill with the sword, that's put to the test.
While all the other men are out hunting, doing noble chivalric deeds, the kinds of things that knights do when it's not wartime, Gawain is in the feminised space of the castle with the ladies. The ladies are actually used as a test to test his honour, his moral integrity. So the lord of the castle's wife comes to Gawain each day on 3 occasions and tries to seduce him. The castle in this romance is a place for testing the integrity, the morals, the honour of the knight.
In the story of Gawain, and in the real world of the Middle Ages, the castle is an arena where the battle of the sexes can be played out. And in this era of courtly love and chivalry, the gentler sex might often prove to be the stronger.
There are special spaces in the castle reserved for women. The lady of the castle, for example, if she's in residence, would have her own rooms, which would be separate from those of the men. You also have this idea in medieval culture at large that one's own body can be like a castle. So we get an inverted notion in medieval festivities and in literary depictions of actually women defending castles. There is a wonderful idea of the castle of love, which features in many round table festivities, for example. You would have a pretend castle built up of paper and other materials that could easily be breached, but the women would defend it by throwing rose petals at the men, and it was meant to be a symbolic gesture of men having to woo ladies to overcome their defences, to be able to win them legitimately and honourably. And so this wonderful idea of the castle of love becomes important in this sense for women as well.
The castle and the idea of romance. A perfect match that came together most famously in one special region of France. Fairy tale châteaux. Gorgeous ceremonies, royal hunting expeditions, Renaissance palaces. Historians credit the Loire with giving birth to a whole way of life, the French way. It all happened because of a military disaster, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Defeated and chased from Paris by the English, the French court took refuge on the banks of the Loire. There was rich and fertile ground here, and river links right across the country. A golden age was about to begin. Once France had found peace again, economic prosperity led to an unprecedented architectural flowering. For the castle builders of the Loire, their time had come. Today, the town of Longshanks still typifies the French way of life. It was already a well-established settlement when King Louis XI decided to build a chateau here in 1465.
Louis XI cherche en fait à montrer son pouvoir et son autorité. Il en est aux premières années de son règne. Donc c'est vrai qu'il cherche à montrer la présence royale sur le territoire tourangeau. Alors Tours, c'est alors la capitale du royaume et il choisit finalement la place de Langeais parce qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup de châteaux royaux sur ce côté-là de la Loire.
The facade the castle presents to the town suggests that its builders had some real military purpose in mind. It has all the conventional features of a defensive citadel. A forbidding fortress-like wall, an array of towers, a drawbridge.
Il a été construit en effet à la fin du Moyen-Âge, donc c'est un modèle assez caractéristique avec du côté de la ville une véritable forteresse très imposante et on a tous les éléments nécessaires en quelque sorte, donc les grandes tours, tout en haut le chemin de ronde sur machicoulis, donc qui permettait aux gardes de surveiller les environs. Et puis on a également le pont-levis. Donc tous ces éléments en fait à l'origine militaire ne vont pas servir au château de Langeais parce qu'il n'y avait pas de danger en Touraine. En fait, on s'en sert pour montrer la puissance royale.
It's Langeais' rear facade which reveals the château's true raison d'être. This is no military bunker. It's a vast and opulent residence built to glorify the king's majesty.
L'ensemble est très bien conçu, très bien distribué, donc ça a été vraiment conçu dès la base comme une résidence, et puis une résidence agréable puisqu'on a beaucoup de fenêtres. Donc là, on voit que ce n'est pas un château fort pour se protéger, on essaye d'avoir de la lumière dans les pièces et avoir des pièces agréables à vivre en fait.
In 1491, just a quarter of a century after it was built, Langeais witnessed one of the most significant weddings in French history. The bride was just 14 years old, but she was already married. She was Anne, Duchess of an independent Brittany. To try to protect that independence against the kings of France, Anne had entered into a marriage by proxy with Maximilian of Austria. But this alliance with the faraway Habsburgs had failed to deliver. France invaded Brittany. Anne was left with little choice. She had to ask the Pope to annul her first marriage, and she had to marry Charles VIII of France instead.
Bien sûr, on avait demandé l'annulation du mariage de Anne et de Maximilien au pape, mais la décision se faisant attendre, eh bien, on a anticipé et on a célébré le mariage à Langeais avant d'avoir obtenu l'annulation du précédent mariage. Donc on essayait de ne pas trop ébruiter en effet cet événement, d'où la grande discrétion voilà, avec les horaires et puis le château de Langeais aussi, puisque la cour n'y résidait pas à ce moment-là.
The quick and secretive early morning ceremony took place here in Langeais, with none of the customary royal pomp, but in front of a small group of influential witnesses.
Le témoin d'Anne de Bretagne, c'était le prince d'Orange, et puis le témoin de Charles VIII, c'était son plus proche cousin, Louis d'Orléans, alors qui deviendra d'ailleurs roi quelques années plus tard sous le titre de Louis XII. Et puis bien sûr le chancelier de France, un des grands personnages du royaume, était présent également à ce mariage. Et donc on a signé le contrat de mariage qui était un véritable programme politique en fait.
Evidently, these powerful friends and allies of Charles were willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that the papal annulment had not yet been agreed. Charles and Anne were joined in matrimony, and Brittany was united with the Kingdom of France. But Anne continued to stand up for her people, and her fascinating life story has another twist to it. Much sooner than she could have anticipated, she was to become Queen of France for a second time. The celebrations marking Anne's second marriage to a French king also took place in the Loire. This time, the venue was the royal château of Blois. In 1498, King Charles had died after an accident. The new king was his cousin, Louis XII. As Prince of Orléans, he'd been a witness at Charles and Anne's wedding just 7 years before. Louis had been born at Blois, and on his accession to the throne, he embarked on the reconstruction of the château where he'd grown up.
Louis XII et Anne de Bretagne affectionnent particulièrement ce château. Louis XII y est né, il y a grandi. C'était à l'époque le pôle d'une véritable culture de cour réunie par son père Charles d'Orléans, notamment une cour poétique, s'étant en quelque sorte retiré de la politique pour se consacrer plutôt à du mécénat culturel. C'est donc dans ce milieu que Louis XII a grandi, qu'il a été baigné.
Blois was already regarded as one of the most beautiful fortresses in France, but Louis resolved to turn it into a true palace. And having cemented France's annexation of Brittany by marrying Anne in Nantes, Louis brought his bride back here for the wedding celebrations. This time, there was to be no secrecy. Blois became the setting for a succession of regal gatherings and diplomatic summits. Archduke Philip of Austria paid his respects, Machiavelli too, and Cesare Borgia came here to be married. At Blois, Anne and Louis presided over a court of dazzling ceremonial and cultural distinction. The chateau's central courtyard is a panorama of French architectural history. There's the great Gothic hall, which dates from the Middle Ages. From the 16th century on, it received the official representatives from every part of France, the Estates General.
Alors, la salle des États généraux fait partie en effet des salles les plus exceptionnelles du château. Elle a d'ailleurs pu être datée très précisément par dendrochronologie, donc l'étude de l'âge du bois dans la charpente, qui date cette charpente précisément de 1214. Donc c'était une salle qui a aujourd'hui exactement 800 ans. Cette grande salle servait en quelque sorte de salle polyvalente qui recevait les grandes cérémonies organisées par les comtes de Blois et plus tard par les rois de France.
The Hall of Estates also served as a ballroom and as a venue for concerts. Nowadays, the huge space conveys the whole story of Blois in a very modern, interactive form. Across the courtyard is the wing added by Louis XII around the time of his wedding to Anne. The royal propaganda presented her as the perfect queen, a symbol of union and peace between France and Brittany. And yet, to the end, she intrigued tirelessly to defend the independence of her duchy. Anne was in residence at Blois for 15 years. When she died here in 1514, her funeral lasted 40 days. The following year, King Louis was succeeded by Francois I. Francois was responsible for Blois' most decorative feature, a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture. The chambers of Francois' new wing are accessed from an astonishing polygonal staircase which projects outward from the line of the facade. The ornamentation is Italianate. The balconies are designed both to see and to be seen. Courtiers could watch the king regally ascending the staircase, and on other occasions they could climb up themselves for a grandstand view of festivities in the courtyard below. Even today, the elegance and grandeur of Blois is palpable. It's easy to conjure up the spirits of those who paraded around this courtyard in its glory days.
Pour moi, travailler au château de Blois est un véritable privilège. D'abord parce que c'est un lieu qui réunit l'histoire, l'architecture, qui abrite aujourd'hui des collections extraordinaires. Et puis surtout, c'est un lieu, un château qui a vécu, qui a été la demeure des comtes de Blois, des rois et des reines de France pendant plus d'un siècle. Et leur présence habite encore ces murs. Et puis, il y a dans ce château des moments magiques, notamment le soir, quand la cour se vide de ses visiteurs. On sent monter dans les murs la présence de tous ces habitants qui ont laissé une partie de leur âme.
In the changing facades of this chateau, we can see the ebb and flow of French history. The rise and fall of dynastic hopes and territorial ambitions. But if the story of Blois is one of adaptation and renewal, another of Europe's most famous castles is home to a quite remarkable continuity across the centuries. Eltz Castle, Berg Eltz, has been in the hands of one family since its construction in the 12th century. Unlike so many German castles, it was unscathed by the wars of the Middle Ages. The present Count, Dr. Karl Graf zu Eltz, represents the 33rd generation of the family to have charge of the castle. The castle stands guard over the Elzbach River, a tributary of the Moselle and a historically important trading route to the fertile Mayfeld, the breadbasket of the region. The entire foundations of the castle stand on top of a narrow column of natural rock which rises 70 metres from the riverbed below. With so little lateral floor space to work with, the castle builders here looked upwards. Berg Eltz is 8 stories tall. Its towers soar up to 40 metres above the rock, and its timber frame structures and fairy tale turrets make it the perfect picture book castle. The accommodation is comprised of 3 interlinking houses. It's a Gannebenberg, a castle belonging to a community of joint heirs. From the early Middle Ages, 3 branches of the same family shared ownership here. They gave their names to the 3 separate living spaces, the Rubenach, Rodendorf and Kempenich houses. Recent scientific tests on the timber have revealed that many of the rooms here date back to the castle's earliest history.
Die neuesten Untersuchungen haben uns nur positive Ergebnisse gebracht. Burg Eltz ist fast überall wesentlich älter, als wir es glaubten. Das kleine Rodendorfer Haus ist nicht aus dem Jahre 1560, wie wir anhand eines Fenstersatzes glaubten, sondern aus dem Jahr 1290. Dieses Haus ist nicht 1400, in dem wir drin sitzen, das kleine Kempenicher, sondern es ist 1290. Und das große, schöne Rübenacher Haus ist nicht 1470, wie die Wandmalereien sagen, sondern 1311. Burg Eltz ist älter geworden, die Geschichte muss neu geschrieben werden.
Berg Eltz has been called the Knight's Castle par excellence, and it boasts a splendid Knight's Hall. This was where the 3 family branches gathered for festivities, to talk about family business and to resolve family disputes. Above the doorway, the Rose of Silence reminds everyone that what's said here should go no further. And the jester's head symbolises freedom of speech within the hall. Medieval jesters were allowed to say whatever they wanted without fear of consequences. Frank talk within the family contributed to centuries of stability for Berg Eltz. The durability of the castle builders' work here is remarkable. All the same, maintaining the fabric of buildings which are centuries old involves huge cost and effort. The Eltz family is now supported in the upkeep of their historic treasure by the state. But for the 33rd generation of the dynasty, the responsibilities remain onerous.
Natürlich ist es eine Last, ein solches Haus zu führen. Es ist eine große Verantwortung gegenüber der Familie, gegenüber der Öffentlichkeit und gegenüber einem selber. Und es war für mich von frühester Jugend an klar, dass ich diese Aufgabe werde schultern müssen. Auf der anderen Seite ist es ein Haus, das durch seine schiere Schönheit einen für jede Arbeit entschädigt. Und deswegen bin ich eher ein glücklicher Mensch als ein mit schwerer Last beladener.
Berg Eltz is rightly celebrated for the vistas of the castle that can be enjoyed from all around the grounds below. From 1965 to 1992, an engraving of one of the views featured on the 500 Deutschmark note, something that evokes nostalgia in many of the German visitors to the castle. And for everyone who comes here, Berg Eltz is a rare glimpse of a bygone age. The remarkable survival of buildings and of values which have disappeared elsewhere in our modern world.
Eine Burg wie Burg Eltz zeigt jedermann seine Geschichte. Keineswegs nur die Geschichte der Herren und Grafen zu Eltz, sondern die Geschichte aller Deutschen. Und diese fasziniert dann doch mehr, als man so allgemein glaubt.
The Eltz family story is a true exception. It's a direct and personal link to the traditions and values which built the medieval castle, and which they have carried down the centuries to this very day. But of course, the mainstream of history was flowing in a very different direction. 250 years ago, a revolution began. The Industrial Revolution. Invention and innovation, scientific discoveries, water power and steam power, new machines and devices. A new mechanical age, consuming raw materials and minerals, and spewing out more and more product. There was change in every aspect of life, and the castle seemed destined to be left behind. But this was the age of surprises. Many castles did fall into ruin, but others found a new role in this industrial era. The wealth created by industry wasn't spread evenly. The workers suffered squalor. They lived in cramped housing without sanitation, in hovels that spread disease and death. The new industrialists became fabulously rich. Some yearned to live in castles, like the barons of old. And the old aristocracy realized the value of the mineral rights on their vast estates. On the sites of what were once modest fortifications, men like the Baron Penrhyn, who controlled the North Wales slate industry, were able to build entirely new fantasy castles. Here they could display their wealth and entertain their guests in lavish style. Fine dining in North Wales, but the most spectacular reimagining of the castle in Victorian times happened at the other end of the country. The Romans built a stone fort in Cardiff, and the castle keep here dates from the Norman invasion. But the castle we see today is largely a byproduct of the black diamond, coal. In the late 19th century, Cardiff grew exponentially to become the world's largest coal port. The docks had been developed by the second Marquis of Bute, whose family had acquired large estates in South Wales by marriage and who'd begun to rebuild the ancient castle in Cardiff. The Bute's fortunes were further enhanced on the floor of Cardiff's coal exchange. Here, contracts to ship out vast quantities of Welsh steam coal were agreed. Legend has it that it's where the world's first £1 million cheque was written. The coal was hewed from beneath the South Wales valleys by a huge workforce who saw little financial reward for their efforts. Much of the land above was owned by aristocrats like the Butes, and it was they who benefited from the mineral rights. When John Patrick Crichton Stewart succeeded as the third Marquis of Bute, he decided to lavish some of his great good fortune on the restoration of Cardiff Castle. In a modernising age, he was a man who loved antiquity. Bute dressed his industrial wealth in clothes of medieval splendour. His dreams were dreams of the castles of old, of romance, of knights and their ladies. He and his architect William Burgess made an exquisite new version of the past. It shines in all its medieval glory, in the heart of the world's capital of coal. Ultimately, it was built on the sweat and blood of the miners. But one castle wasn't enough for the Marquis. On the outskirts of Cardiff, his vivid Victorian imagination and untold wealth produced another Gothic fantasy, a fairy tale castle in the woods. Castell Coch was also designed by Burgess. Given free rein by his paymaster, Burgess didn't hold back. Dazzling ceilings, extravagant decoration, fanciful fireplaces. It was all a bit much for the colliers who'd done all the hard work. As they were finishing their night shifts, the Marquis and his lady might have been waking up in the luxury of this astounding bedroom. Except that they very rarely did. For all the money spent, there's no evidence that the Buttes slept for more than a handful of nights here. This outlandish wash basin was a utility scarcely ever utilized. Today, both of Butte's castles are in public hands, and Cardiff's appeal as a tourist destination stands squarely on the enduring magic of the castle that Burgess restored. It's a palace of wonders, and now a gilded stage for global diplomacy. Where the Buttes once feasted, world leaders now sit down together. Our story has come full circle. Once again, the castle is the seat of military might and regal hospitality. In this series, we've seen the castle develop across the centuries. From the early days of the Motte and Bailey and the square stone keeps of the Normans, the castle builders were constantly looking to innovate. By combining numerous round towers in one unbroken defensive line, Richard the Lionheart found a way to strengthen the castle's design in Normandy's magnificent Château Gaillard. Caerphilly was the first castle in Britain designed to be defended by walls within walls. It took protective strategy to a whole new level, in which there were multiple layers of fortification. And in the active defensive system of Carcassonne, the castle came close to being impregnable. This was a defensive system on a grand scale, which allowed the garrison to carry the fight to anyone who threatened the citadel. It was said to be untakeable, the perfect castle. In the 21st century, these architectural details still fascinate children of all ages.
The castle's big, and it's like the safest place you can go and stay.
More than any other historical structure, the castle gets a grip on their imaginations in their classroom projects. And it enables them to visualize a whole medieval way of life when they make their school visits. But castles are fun as well as being educational. Within sight of the real Windsor Castle, the Legoland Resort trades on the excitement that the castle represents for the whole family. The model of Caerphilly Castle here was carefully constructed with more than 100,000 plastic bricks. It took 289 hours to make. It reminds us the real thing was built in little more than 3 short years. Here, the castle stands as a global icon, alongside models of world cities like Paris, Amsterdam, and London. Whether they're the thrilling centerpieces of leisure parks or pulling in the crowds as tourist attractions in their own right, castles have never been more popular. But they're not just objects of wonder for the young.
My career has been in ruins, and it still is today. And the most impressive ruins of all are those of castles. I've been fascinated by castles, partly because I see them as the theatres in which some of the great political, social, and even family events of the Middle Ages took place. Castles are the most tangible reminder of the magnificence that was achieved in the Middle Ages.
This is power. This is an expression of power, whether it's military power or symbolic power or what have you. I find castles fascinating because I'm allowed to go around them now in a democratic age. You know, this was a place built by the most powerful man in Western Europe, and now I can wander around his bedroom. I can sit in the place where he prayed to the Almighty. These buildings have become democratized. That is what makes castles fascinating. That is what makes them such a delight for children and grown-up medieval historians.
Whatever age we are, the castle appeals to us because of its strength as well as its beauty.
Castles have a brutal side to them. They remind us of the reality of our past, how our lives and society has changed. It was a time when people and nations were oppressed by the castle builders and the castle owners, but also they conjure up in our minds images of knights riding out, doing wonderful chivalric deeds, of damsels in distress needing protecting. They hearken back to a golden age that never existed, but that we would like to imagine once did.
Whether they originated in a golden age or not, castles have stood the test of time. Today, their ramparts are open to us all to explore. And the more we learn about them, the more we're drawn to investigate further. The castle builders not only constructed an intriguing past, they built a solid future too.